5 minutes before I fell off this cliff. I'm going to pass it around.
Wow.
It was a beautiful oak forest in the middle of this, on this mountaintop, in the middle of a Doug fir and cedar and pine forest. Very unusual. But what it made it even more unusual, I'm telling you guys because you have to put up with this. What made it more unusual is from this ridge line, you could actually see the Yuba River going east in this direction, and then a mile and a half, it's going west in the other direction. You see both of them in the same location, standing in the same place. Look to the left, you see the Yuba River, and then it makes this long hairpin turn, and a mile and a half comes back to this side. Very unusual. What I didn't know is right at the end of this ridge was a 50-foot cliff. And I tripped, did a somersault, went over this cliff head first, and I don't recommend that you flip through this because you'll see a lot of unfortunate moves. So just,
Is that California?
that's California, Sierra Mountains. Sierra County, only 3,000 people. It's a great place. Okay. Well, the topic is not that. The topic is neighborhoods. And in particular, neighborhoods that were co-organized, like Lucia and Jim did tonight, co-developed, co-designed, and lived in together. And fortunately or unfortunately, I think it's very unfortunate, but it doesn't seem like great neighborhoods get designed any other way these days. I mean, we just can't depend on developers, bankers, and bureaucrats coming up with the right decisions. We actually, as architects, design plenty of for sale, nonprofit housing, etc. But if we ever started talking about, how hard is it to go next door and borrow a cup of sugar, people think, they look at you with this glossy-eyed notion. All the regular things that come up over and over and over again in the context of making a neighborhood. Now, sometimes people would think a neighborhood with real people. Sometimes people might think, does that take it longer, for example? And, we did a project, I'm going to show you a few slides of it, in 2004. That year, that 30-unit co-housing development got Neighborhood of the Year in the USA. There was 1.5 million houses built that year in the USA. And this project developed mostly by school teachers. Our community is 13 school teachers. They're often the plurality of the people who live in these communities. How did they figure out how to make the best neighborhood in the country? And so it's not only the ability to make the best neighborhood in the country, but we were surrounded by 3 other brand new developments. One took 5 years, 5 years, and 7 years, and this project took 3 years start to finish. So how did that happen? Well, again, the future residents make all the difference. They're the fourth element that brings all the sanity to the table. And over again, people say to me, Chuck, you've designed 55 of these communities now, you've visited almost 400. Why don't you just design it? And I find over and over again that people bring real values to the table, real experiences, life experiences, and every time they make a better neighborhood than I would unilaterally. And yet, I think that's the reason why so many aren't that great, is because a couple of people are crafting these things the best they can, but they're not that interesting, and they're nowhere near as interesting, in my view, as a co-housing community, and I hope you feel the same when we're done. Now, how did I get interested in co-housing? Well, in 1980, I was going to the University of Copenhagen, downtown Copenhagen, and every day I had a 20-minute walk to the train station every day. And every day I noticed that I'd walk by single-family houses, and there was no life between the buildings. An occasional salutation, hey Joe, haven't seen you. Walk by apartment buildings, no life between the buildings. Walk by condos, no life between the buildings. And I was walking by this one development every single day that there always seems to be life between the buildings. People having a cup of tea together, sitting at the picnic table, having a conversation. People coming to and from this building where apparently nobody lived, but everybody lived. Later I learned that was the common house. So one day I stopped and I asked this woman in my broken Danish, what's going on here? And this woman replied in her perfect English that, her and her husband had both grown up in a high-functioning neighborhood where people knew each other, cared about each other, and supported each other at some basic level. And it was important to them that their two children grew up in a high-functioning neighborhood, and they were concerned that for the most part that would be a crapshoot whether they pulled it off or not. And so they weren't going to take any chances. They were going to take, in fact, a very creative approach to it, and that's why, the Danes, where cohousing got started, would often say things like, we're not doing anything new. Neighborhoods have been around, villages, been around forever, but we're simply now consciously creating what used to happen much more naturally, much more as an extension of our culture. And it's hard to say what happens now as an extension of our culture. Now it's mostly a planning act or a financial act, but it's hardly a cultural act. I'd like to not think so, because that doesn't bode well to our culture if typical strip commercial, for example, has anything to do with our culture. But it's been removed from our culture. So co-housing brings neighborhood development back, brings neighbors. As I was introduced in Cleveland a couple months ago, this woman, got up to the podium. I think I was the only white guy in the room, and she said, "Chuck is here to talk about bringing the neighbor back to the hood." So that's how I got interested. At that moment, as soon as this woman described this to me, about an hour later, as I was sitting there having a cup of tea and being late for school, etc., I realized that there's nothing too new or too groovy about this. I mean, it's nothing way out. In fact, it's a very conservative notion. I'm not taking any chance with my neighborhood. I'm not going to roll the dice. We're not going to roll the dice. Neighborhood is actually an important component of our well-being, of any town, of any larger community. High-functioning neighborhoods are an important component, so we're going to be part of the solution, not only for our family, but for the larger town as well. So, another way I got interested in it is I grew up in a small town, only 325 people in Northern California. The whole county only has 3,000 people. And Katie, my wife, subsequently talked me into moving right into the geographic center of San Francisco. And I realized, it didn't take me long to realize that the social life in San Francisco is quite different than it is in this town. And in fact, let me just make sure I got that's my grandmother, by the way. And she actually was bedridden her last 10 years of her life, and 15 different people in that town played a germane role in her well-being over those 10 years. Made sure she had all the food she needed and the care, and rolled over in bed, and all the gossip she needed, which was considerable, because she was missing out on it because she wasn't at the bench anymore. And so people had to bring it to her. And I noticed living in downtown San Francisco, I'd say hello to somebody and they would immediately look at their shoes. And I started saying, yeah, those are great shoes. But it's just, for any number of wide range of reasons, people act differently in a city-like setting than they do in this kind of a small town. And a town that, this community is only in a town of 3,000 people. So it turns out there's lots of advantages even in a small town. But, and so we decided to try to make a small town social setting, a high-functioning neighborhood, even in the big city of San Francisco. Well, we actually didn't find a piece of property in San Francisco. We ended up finding a piece of property, literally as you land across the Bay Bridge. And ended up building a place there and living there for 12 and a half years. But the point was, in this setting of all these city people, it was very much like a small town, and that's what we were looking for. And we raised our daughter there, and that made so much sense for so many reasons. I mean, it was an incredibly family-friendly setting. She now works for the UN. 24 years old, she did the keynote speech at the UN's 70-year anniversary in Chicago. And every hallmark she reaches is all a function of growing up in cohousing. when she ran for school senate, and she called me up and said, you know, Dad, I'm in a very highly politicized school, Occidental, where Obama went. She called me up and she said, oh, Dad, I'm so worried. You know, there's 7 people running. And all I could say is, I sure feel sorry for those other kids. They don't have a chance. They don't have a chance. And she, within a couple of weeks, she had half the campus wearing Vote for Jesse t-shirts that they paid for. So she simply knew how to help people get organized and, you know, did a good job. And you can very much tell, this is back in Nevada City, that where I live, that, you know, the kids own the place with, you know, mentoring from time to time. She's having her 80th birthday this weekend. I'm going to miss it, unfortunately. But it's very much a kid-friendly, you know, a senior-friendly world. And that was a couple of key goals that the groups set out for themselves very early on. Kid-friendly, 37 kids. Senior-friendly, 20 seniors and 37 other adults. So 57 adults total and 37 kids for a total of 94 people.
And where was this?
Nevada City, California. It's halfway between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe. Again, over and over again, I find that nobody does a better job of laying out the neighborhood than the future residents. But we do it together. It's highly facilitated. I mean, I bring the blocks, etc. But the group spends a couple days, you don't really see it here, you'll see it in other slides, creating criteria, 2 full days. And then on Monday night and Tuesday night, we actually lay the blocks away around. Interesting, this one's in Maine. And interestingly enough, this guy lived on 50 acres off the grid, 4 miles out of town, Belfast, Maine, on a dirt road. And 4 miles on a dirt road is a long way. It's a real pain. But went out there for dinner and blah, 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 but came back to do this planning. And so interesting to work with that guy, and everybody else in Maine, frankly, because, you know, we had 35 acres, and everybody started off with these, you know, quite distance between the houses. But as they talked more and more about the behavior that they wanted between the houses, in particular the notion of having as much community as you want and as much privacy as you want, and balancing that and making sure that that worked, as opposed to typical neighborhoods where you feel like, especially where he lived before, where you had all the privacy you wanted and all the privacy you wanted. In other words, no choice whatsoever. And one of the reasons I feel that, you know, cohousing seems to be resonating with the American culture is that we like choices. So why wouldn't you have community and privacy, not just privacy and privacy, for example? But anyway, as he became more and more familiar with the notion that if I move the houses closer together, you know, this level of community works better, kind of like a cocktail party. You know, you can simply have a conversation with people. And the back of my house, my area behind me, I actually have more privacy. So as they got more and more familiar with that, and more familiar with the notion that the closer that they got, the lower the prices went, because obviously infrastructure goes way down when there's one sewer line going through like that, and one water line going through like that, as opposed to spread all over hell and high water. Then all of these values came to the table in a way that made this a logical solution, and they ended up building that. So, you know, this is Nevada City, you know, very rural group of people, very iconoclastic. I was very worried about it, you know, that's not how we do it around here, kind of attitude. But they didn't. They had 11 acres to work with, and they ultimately put the houses on 3.5 acres, again, more and more as they talked about the ramifications of putting this house there, and that house there, and this house there, and that house there, etc., until they, you know, moved into that location. They talked about it, they established it, I watched until, you know, things got crazy at any level, and then I would help. But I tried, like everybody else, to do it based on the criteria that they had generated. Goals, like, you know, facilitating a spontaneous social life, child-friendly, elderly-friendly, earth-friendly are the kind of goals that you can predict will come up on every single project. And then, what if I put this house here? How does that, in fact, facilitate or detract from child-friendly, kid-friendly, kid-friendly, adult-friendly, you know, earth-friendly, etc. In fact, we do this blocks in 2 separate rooms with the same group until, and they constantly critique each other because they're always looking back to their same criteria to come up with the same, or not to come up with the same house plan, site plan, but to come up with a site plan that best reflects that, optimizes the potential of that criteria they've already put on the table.
So there are two groups going on at the same
At
time?
the same time, over 2 nights.
Wonderful.
And, the beginning of the second night, some people come in and talk about, from the other group, everybody comes in and talks about what this group is accomplishing, not based on what the criteria they put on the table. And then later that night, this group goes to the other room and talks about what they're doing. It's all quite, I don't want to call it scientific, but we learned after 25 months of working with the Danes, when Kate and I went back, and very much got ensconced with this very anthropological approach to helping people realize their potential, realize their goals, objectify, rhetoric, basically. People always have bring all this rhetoric to the table around affordable and earth-friendly. Well, is it or isn't it? It's in the cards, basically, and then manifesting that. In Denmark, the best practitioners are what they call cultural workers, people who really get into this group of people and figure out what they're doing. In the case of the U.S., the architects have become our amateur anthropologists, and we're trying to do the same things. But it's, again, it's consciously creating an environment for understanding who the culture is. Another site plan. Actually, I think this is the second one for that other group, for that same group. That's one reason to do it, is that A, we come up with the best site plan. The second reason we do it this way is because, who's more proud and who's going to champion a project anywhere near than the co-authors of that project? I really believe that everybody's got a little bit of architect in them. Even that infant, will pipe up at judicious times in an odd way. And remind us all, one of the reasons that we're doing this is future generations, etc. And by the way, they break a lot of rules in the course of making these neighborhoods, because the rules are made to create what you see driving around Hood River or Portland or any town, which tend to be wide streets, tend to be houses separated, not necessarily energy efficient. We do a lot to call them energy efficient, but there's no way to make houses more energy efficient than connecting them, for example. So anyway, there's always the need to champion. We just finished a project in downtown Vancouver, BC, where we wanted half the parking as a city regs. Well, believe me, these guys had to champion that. I could stand up there and talk all day, but we would not have gotten the project approved. But when this nursing mom is championing it, believe me, these city councilors are so uncomfortable, they're just going, of course. Why wouldn't we do that? Spontaneous lifestyle, a common goal. These three women here were headed to go to the movies one Sunday night and ran into Victoria, and Victoria's texting her husband, going to the movies. It doesn't get much more spontaneous than that. And you kind of go, I even myself, I go, so what? She's going to the movies. She would have otherwise maybe not gone. But, this is how you stitch a society together. Connections, connectivity. And it may not have been a big deal for Victoria, but I can tell you there's a lot of single moms out there, or even married moms, who would love to have a little bit of that spontaneousness in their life. Widowers, we hear all the time from widowers who either live, or widows, who live in co-housing, that they don't, they would be like the typical American otherwise, watching 6.5 hours of TV a day, if you don't have this kind of a spontaneous lifestyle. And that spontaneous lifestyle leads to a lot of other things, including the fact that I was having dinner at a senior co-housing recently, and after dinner, this guy, Butch, he described to me how for 20 years living at a single-family house, he was buying 5 to 6 tanks of gas per month, and after moving into the co-housing, he was buying about less than 1 tank of gas per month. So there's a lot of measurable differences in the context of a functioning society that you don't see in the context of, spread equidistant across the landscape kind of setting. Leo here, when we were planning our project, went on and on. She's 80, had built her own house previously, and went on and on about how her and her husband had designed their own house previously, lived in the woods, and Chuck, it's got to be completely private. We're all into privacy, 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 privacy. It amazes me how, we found when we were studying co-housing the first time that 80% of the time that people were in their front yard or backyard, they were in their front yard in co-housing, which is the complete inverse of typical neighborhoods where people spend 80% in their backyard and 20% in their front yard. So, I expected to see Leah here 80% of the time, no matter what she said. But it turns out she's here about 100% of the time. I've never seen her in her backyard. She has all the privacy she could ever want. And I've never seen her there. So, at some level it's a little unpredictable. I mean, over and over again, I see that, one of the spouses, it's their idea, they drag the other one in, kicking and screaming. But you would never guess 2 years later which one of those spouses that was, frankly. You never would guess because, either he or she is in the common house 5 times more than the other one, no matter what they said. And that's fine. Obviously, later it's a function of what makes sense for you. I mean, in the end of the day, I think Anne Rand is probably correct. We only do things for ourselves, and that's fine. But when you start to live in the setting, you find out how much easier life is, more convenient, more practical, more economical, more interesting, more fun, then you alter your behavior accordingly, basically. And you should, unless you're completely ensconced, in whatever propaganda we subscribe to. I don't know, does anybody here know who has starred in more movies in the U.S. than any other actor? Anybody guess? Wild guess?
John Wayne.
John Wayne, exactly. That's a lot of propaganda, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which I've yet to witness, by the way. And, we live out that sort of true grit cowboy thing, whether we like it or not, and the idea of cooperating with our neighbors to make our life more economical, more practical, more convenient is just a little lost since the pioneers came out. We certainly had it when we were pioneering the West. Pardon? Oh, but anyway, so it's a little lost. Now, Leo, she's like the Walmart greeter. Even though privacy, okay, Leo, we'll do it. She's got all the privacy she could ever want. There's her backyard. I've never seen her there. 0. There's a life between the buildings. You get that, basically. People stop, chat about, the issues of the day. Interesting thing about this greenhouse, we had a 95-year-old woman move into the co-housing, and her kids insisted that she move in the houses close to the parking. And 2 years later, at 97, she bought this house that was at the very back of the community, 700 feet from a parking space. And I said, Meg, what are you doing? What are you doing? I was even a little surprised. And she said, Chuck, it turns out that my relationship with my neighbor is more important than my relationship with my car when it comes to my quality of life. That's the kind of consciousness that people grow under that setting. I want to see these guys when I wheel by them or hobble by them, playing cards so I can stop and laugh or whatever. And that's life in co-housing right there. And yet, she has all the privacy she wants in the back of her house. Oh, here she is right here. I prematurely told that story. Our job, I feel over and over again, is to very much, and I find it the most exciting part of our job, is to do what we can to absolutely reflect who that group is. I feel like that's just the funnest part, because I have to go in there and play anthropology, which, we've gained a lot of skill in doing, and figure out who they were. Well, it wasn't any mystery with this group. They told us from the very day one, Chuck, we're really into dancing. Make sure you can spring the floors and, raise the lights, and Chuck, we're really into dancing. They only had to tell me once, but they chose to repeat it over again. So on their very first common dinner, May 12, 2000, sure enough, right after dinner, they pulled the tables out of the way and somebody grabbed a fiddle and they started dancing. I was pretty impressed, actually. And I like it when, all this value that they put on the table gets manifested architecturally, and it plays out, and from a lifestyle point of view. So I thought, well, okay, we'll see how this goes tomorrow. And sure enough, on the very next day, they pulled the tables out of the way and danced again. So, I mean, it's a literal example of the job of, in fact, reflecting who that culture is. And as architects, I don't know how obvious it is, but we're into design, and we're into making warm and cozy places, no doubt. Very much into design. I actually designed those chairs as well. But our mantra in our office is, if it doesn't work socially, why bother? I mean, anybody can cut down trees and make a space and photograph it and all the rest, but to make it where it's got a heartbeat, that's the goal. And make a place where 6 nights a week, people would rather be having dinner in our common house. We have dinner formally 6 nights a week. Katie and I participate probably 2 or 3 times a week. And, but you do whenever you feel like it. Nobody has to participate in eating dinner at all, but you participate because you want to, because you'd rather be nowhere else. And that's, in my view, why people participate. And whether it's 10 o'clock coffee like they do at Bellingham Cohousing, or dinner or whatever, it's always amazing to me. Because I did a project just down the street from Bellingham, I was staying at this co-housing, and I was amazed at 10 a.m. every day there was, a half a dozen to a dozen people in the common house having coffee. Don't these have jobs? But anyway, I think if you took any regular neighborhood, you would find that want, that need, basically, as some neutral place, not necessarily a commercial place, but a place where we can make our own OJ and have coffee and talk about the day and go for a bicycle ride later or whatever they plan to do. Another key element of co-housing is that it's self-managed entirely. I hear people say all the time, well, I used to live in a condo and I really didn't like the HOA, etc. And I wouldn't blame you. I don't know if I could ever live in one. I don't think so. Largely because a typical condo has 5 to 7 people who are on the board, voted in, and they have all this fiduciary responsibility, so they end up being very conservative, enforcing all these ridiculous rules as far as I'm concerned. Can't have any flowers within 5 feet of the house because you might compromise the footing, just ridiculous stuff. Well, where I live, every single adult's on the board. And that makes for super intelligent, decision making, I find, over and over again, basically. One of the things I like about where I live, and I think makes it work, is nobody likes meetings. They come on a Saturday morning with their kayak skirt on and their bicycle lycra on, and they're ready to get out of there the minute it's over. We manage the ranch. We have to manage the ranch, just like you would anywhere else. So I think we do a lot better job of it together. Common dinner is a central component to any village. Frankly, I don't know of any means of stitching a community together better than breaking bread. If I ever learned of a better means, I might, suggest it to a co-housing group. But in our culture, anyway, and I think it's rather timeless in general, that most cultures do stitch themselves together over dinner making. And it's not just the sustenance of having nutrition and such, even though, boy, these people get to be ridiculous aficionados. It's over the charts. Just talk about, whatever. But